For someone who's had an iPad in their hand since they were 2 years old, how do you tell them that that's not okay? What I'm experiencing with dealing with young adults is there is extremes, right? They're very black and white thinkers, or we teach them to be black and white thinkers, and they live in a very gray world where everything is blurred and they're just trying to figure it out.
Welcome to Beyond Theory, a podcast powered by Meadows Behavioral Healthcare that brings you in-depth conversations with firsthand insights from the people on the front lines of mental health and addiction recovery. I'm David Condos, and today's guest is Whitney Howzell, Clinical Director of the Claudia Black Center. She sits down with me to explore the blurred world that young adults are growing up in, how that environment affects their development, and how she helps them find connection and support. So let's get out of the abstract and see how this applies in the real world. It's time to go beyond theory.
Hello, my name is Dr. Whitney Howzell, and I am the Clinical Director of the Claudia Black Center for Young Adults.
Well, Dr. Howzell, thank you so much for being with us. Good to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start with introducing you, talking about your story. I know you have kind of an interesting journey starting from public health, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I got my master's in public health in 2009. Wow, it's been a while. So I started off with health education. Working in the school system with Planned Parenthood, doing sex education. Like I was the lady that walked around with with the bag of condoms and pregnancy prevention stuff. And then I transitioned into working with the CDC as well as the health department. So more of doing some epidemiological studies, tracking disease. And what I would do is once we track the disease, we would come up with a community initiative to address it. So the gamut from cancer outbreaks to STDs to HIV rates, we would go in, figure out where the need for the community was and create the community intervention to address it. So it was an adventure. It was fun. That work took me from West Palm Beach, Florida to Maryland, to DC, and to Philadelphia and New Jersey.
Yeah. And so what was kind of the draw for you, looking at that public health, kind of helping the community? What motivated you in that? Yeah.
I've had a family mission statement or marching orders to serve. And my undergrad degree was in health education, and public health just seemed like a natural transition into building off of that health education work. I wanted to actually go into the public health corps, but I kind of got derailed into the Army. I know we'll get into that shortly, but the goal was to get into a public health career, join the public health corps.
Is that an official term?
It is. It's the public health corps. It is like it's like any other military service, but it specifically addressed public health issues. So they work directly under the Surgeon General. There's not many branches, I don't believe, throughout the states, but when I moved to the DC area, it was prime real estate to get a job in there. And I just figured, I'll just transition into that from the Army. I figured I would give the Army maybe 3 years tops and then transition in. Didn't happen like that. 8 years later, I was still in the U.S. Army. Very proud of my service, but it's very interesting how life can take, twists and turns.
Yeah. And so let's get into your Army service now. And so you were a soldier, an enlisted member of the Armed Forces, and then you decided to stay for your career. So talk us through that.
Yeah. So I remained in the Army Reserve for 8. I did a 2 and 8. Well, 8 years total, 6 and 2. So all at Fort Dix, which is a joint base. So Army, Air Force, and Navy. And I was division level. So primarily in charge of training troops who are about to be deployed. Most of my work was, around human resources, colloquial speaking, but I work very closely with the unit STARS program, which was basically it was a study that the Army came up with to assess resiliency. And really the initiative was directed toward preventing suicide, which is huge in the military. We know today that it's still huge among our veteran population. I was doing that work, working closely with our EO, or Equal Opportunity Officer. Always knew, and in the back of my head, that maybe, therapy is the path for you. So I decided to go back to school again, and I got another degree in clinical social work, and another master's in education, and finally my PhD in human sexuality studies.
That's a lot of studies.
So it just means I owe Sally Mae a lot of money.
Yeah,
that's what that means. Yeah,
that's a lot of work. And then, so looking back at the STARS program, you said what did that look like? Like what was the work you were doing?
Yeah, so at the time, the military knew that, and I can obviously only speak for the branch of service that I was in, which was the Army. Was you're seeing people who are either deploying or from us coming back. So how do we prepare them for civilian life? How do we prepare them for being deployed in a life that's very stressful? Yeah. I remember just being in boot camp and I went in a little older, like 26, if you want to call that older, and being in boot camp with 17, 18-year-olds. The amount of stress and trauma that people were coming in with, and now you're about to go into another high stress situation. I think the military really knew we have to prepare these soldiers as much as possible. We have to give them coping skills. We just have to, just provide a safe environment for them to tell someone.
Right.
So a lot of the initiative was, hey, we're here for you. We care. Let us help. Say something. Grab a battle buddy. Talk to someone.
And so you were a person that they could come to?
Yeah. Okay. I mean, primarily it was me, and then, okay, well, let me get you some outreach. Like, let's talk to the chaplain. Let's talk to, our social work officer. Let's talk to a therapist. Let me get you some outside resources. That was pivotally important when we're dealing with the reserve side. So we don't see them every day. You're coming in and you're going to report 1 week in a month. Maybe we see you 2 weeks out of the month for training, and then you're off to your your daily life.
Kind of getting thrown between those two worlds back and forth.
Yeah, I know that can be very stressful. For a younger person, it can be very disheveling. So you need that added support, or moreover, just somebody to say, hey, I see you. Do you need something? So that was the primary initiative around that, at least the way our unit implemented it.
And what were some of the main kind of issues that you were seeing people come in with?
A lot of family of origin issues. I mean, if you're talking about a young person joining any service, you're trying to develop a concept of self. You're looking for, what is this thing that I'm supposed to be doing with my life? Maybe I figured out this school is not for me. Maybe, I just want a way to serve in any capacity, and naturally serving, one's country is a very explicit way to do that, so right? It's
kind of finding your identity, finding your value.
Yeah, absolutely. And you even notice that with older people who came in, I think there is an innate desire for humans to serve in general. And I think that's part of connection. And you would find that a lot with service members.
Yeah, I know. And I know you mentioned you saw some trauma in that work as well with the service members, with sexual assault, PTSD.
Yeah, absolutely. And while the STARS program was initially directed toward preventing suicide, you get into, well, why is this coming up for people? So we would hear about the gamut of sexual assaults, whether, male or female, drug use, family of origin issues, immediate family, children. Like, it could be the gamut of things that were compounding on top of the service, or maybe on top of the combat that they just saw.
On top of the stress.
Yeah. Wow. Complicated trauma is real.
Yeah. And so kind of as you've described your journey so far in this story, you were kind of in a place where you were able to be a person that they could turn to, but you had to kind of facilitate them getting the right help they need. And then eventually you decided to make that switch and become a therapist.
Yeah.
Talk us through that.
Yeah. So, halfway through my service, like I said, I went back to school and I entered into a dual degree program. So there was a clinical track and educational track. I obviously chose the clinical track because I wanted to be a therapist. Finished at Whitney University in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and immediately got licensed and started working.
Yeah, and so you got your doctorate in human sexuality.
Yes.
Well, what about that specifically spoke to you? And kind of then what did it teach you about human sexuality?
Right. Everyone, from the time they're born to the time they leave this planet, you're a sexual being. That doesn't necessarily mean we're talking about the behavior or act of sex, right? We're talking about intimacy. We're talking about healthy relationships. We're talking about bonding that in a healthy manner. We're talking about developing your sense of sexual self and being able to express it in a healthy way. And I saw more of that dealing with my adolescence at Child Guidance than working with any couple or adult.
Really? So that kind of taught you more about what that looked like in the real world?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the freedom to work with an adolescent or young adult in general, or the flexibility, because they're so open. They're looking for guidance, for acceptance. I personally think that when we're talking or we're on this renaissance of sexuality and being able to express it, young adults are more open than I think any age group. They're more accepting. And for a lot of them, it's what they've grown up with and seen all their life. It's a societal norm now, if that makes any sense. Yeah.
And so fast forward to what you're doing now.
Yeah.
It sounds like having a background in, working with people finding their identity in service, in the Army, and in sexuality, that would have a lot of overlap with the young adult population you're working with now. Would you say that?
Absolutely. It's definitely a hodgepodge. And again, it feels great to work with a population that's so open to expanding their horizon, not as it applies to, let's say, attraction or orientation, but who I am as a sexual being, or, beyond that, who I am as a person. I'll say again that the best work that we do at the Claudia Black Center is around developing a concept of self in all facets.
All right, so then let's dive a little bit deeper into the Claudia Black Center right now. So it's working with young adults, age 18 to 26. Okay.
And they come in with a gamut of issues and disorders. I think the cornerstone or the work that we treat is emotional trauma, unresolved emotional trauma. Young adults who have dual diagnoses and addiction issues, substance, other process issues. We treat the lot of it.
Yeah. And so what are some of the major challenges, the main issues that you see cropping up again and again?
And although young adults are, they're flexible and they're open-minded, they're also in that in-between stage where they really want their autonomy, but they're still so dependent on mom and dad. So I think the biggest barrier that we are challenged with is rebelliousness. I think...
Like rebelling against the clinicians?
The clinicians, their parents, they're rebelling against the world. They don't want people to tell them what to do. At that age, I make up a lot of people thought, I got this under control. I know what I'm doing and I don't need your help.
Yeah. Like you don't understand me.
Right. Yeah. You've never been 18 before, even though you're 35. You just skipped over that whole developmental stage. And it's challenging in that, developmentally speaking, until someone turns 25, 26, their frontal lobe isn't even fully developed. Imagine that when you have that, and then you add trauma on top of that, and then you add substance use or any type of process addiction. So I hold empathy that, and there's a lot going on in their head, in their world, and they're just trying to figure it out. I think that not just with our population, but it's par for the course with anyone dealing with unresolved trauma or addiction issues, that denial and resistance are a big part of the beginning of their recovery. And we just, we approach them in a compassionate and comprehensive way to do that.
Yeah. So I was going to say, how do you break through? Like, how do you reach somebody who is resistant, who is standoffish about that?
Yeah. I pull on my old social work adages that you meet people where they are, you know. Maybe you're not willing to embrace a label of addiction, but can we, you know, acknowledge that these behaviors are at least problematic? And I experienced that too in working in other areas at the Meadows, like a gentle path, right? You know, sex addiction is still such a taboo, even with our younger people. Okay, I'm not going to hold on that it's an addiction, but can we, you know, say that this is problematic for you? This is affecting
What are the results?
Yeah. You know, have there been long-term consequences? What's interesting for young adults is there often hasn't been that yet, right?
It hasn't been enough time passed to see that.
Exactly. So they're stuck in that's not going to happen to me, or I got this under control. So again, you know, just meeting them where they're at, asking them, what are your treatment goals? Like, we're really, really collaborative with them. Like, what do you want to work on? If it's not this thing, if this is the thing that mom and dad are pushing you on, imagine that this is the time where you get to be completely selfish. There has to be something, you know, and just trying to extend that olive branch and step into their world has been helpful.
Yeah. Yeah. And so now you mentioned like the family involvement earlier. Describe that dynamic, because these are adults,
Sure.
But a lot of them, I imagine, are still like either very involved with their family or how does that play out?
Yeah. Again, it's that in-between stage where there are two extremes. They're either really enmeshed, meaning, you know, I have to control everything that my child does in an unhealthy manner and can't relinquish any of that to either, I don't know, let them fall flat on their face, or either let them develop their autonomy in a healthy way, or they're really avoidant. You know, I'm going to send my child to your program for 45 days and you better fix them. Which is not
I don't want to have anything to do with it,
right,
basically. Yeah.
Right. Or just the expectation of this is a cure-all. As if, you know, for any form of addiction, we have a magical pill that's just going to be fixed in 45 days, which we know is unrealistic, particularly if you've been at this addiction or you've been in your trauma half your life, you know. By Family Week, you know, they get to see how maybe enmeshed or avoidant their system has been. We don't pretend to offer intensive family therapy, only because ethically speaking, there's just not enough time to do that type of work. But we at least want to lay the groundwork and give them enough resources to continue doing that very, very important therapeutic work when they leave our center.
Yeah, yeah. And so another kind of element that comes to mind when you're thinking about young adults, this population, is kind of just what it's like to be a young adult in this day and age, as opposed to 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 50 years ago. How is that kind of constantly changing, the technology, the things that are a part of, you know, people's lives that weren't before? How does that change like your job? Like how do you approach that?
Keeps me on my toes. Yeah. It keeps our clinical staff on their toes. And I'm so glad you mentioned the word technology. Again, this is one of the first generations that have grown up with all facets of technology, being computers, internet, video games, television, social media. I mean, I didn't have that. At least, you know, I remember coming of age.
Or didn't have it as constantly with you all the time. Yeah.
Exactly. So I think there is this almost social divide in that what is healthy and what is not. What is socially normative to them and what's not for us. Right? Okay. So I take things like tech addiction, which is a big thing. For someone who's had an iPad in their hand since they were 2 years old, how do you tell them that that's not okay, right? Or what do their social skills look like with other people face to face? They handle conflict different, if they even know how to handle conflict at all, if they even know what a healthy relationship looks like outside of a DM, right? So those are some of the challenges. But understanding that we're not going to be quick to say this is an addiction, this is problematic. But again, I go back to, how is this affecting your world? How does this affect your interpersonal relationships? Can you get work done after you've been on a video game for 10 to 12 hours? Can you be a productive part of society? And I use that very loosely because I know it's very subjective to each person, their job, and where they come from. So I think right now it's a lot of information gathering. It's different for every young adult. And like I said, there's definitely a cultural evolution. What I'm experiencing with dealing with young adults is there is extremes, right? They're very black and white thinkers, or we teach them to be black and white thinkers, and they live in a very gray world where everything is blurred and they're just trying to figure it out. Yeah.
And I liked how you kind of described that cultural division or whatever it is, whereas somebody who has grown up with like mobile devices or internet for their whole life, as long as they can remember, what they perceive as being a relative normal is going to be different.
Right. Yeah. And it'll probably be different in 10 years.
Exactly. Yeah. It'll keep changing.
In 10 years. And I'm willing to bet that they're more amenable to adapting to the culture than we are. So as clinicians, we know we have to constantly stay on our toes about what are appropriate interventions to problematic or compulsive behaviors as it relates to technology, as it relates to substances, other process addictions, or even intimacy in relationships.
Yeah. And so when you see that tech is causing a problem, how do you approach that? Like, what does a long-term plan look like? Because I feel like a life without tech, like tech abstinence, is not possible.
It's not possible.
How do you do that?
Moderation. Moderation. Again, I go back to asking very basic questions. Is this affecting your day-to-day living? Can you get up? Can you eat? Do you remember to go to work? Are you having other social interactions with someone that's not in your headphones or screen time? Are you able to hold down a job? Is your health okay? You know, those very, very basic questions around what does problematic tech use look like, firstly. And again, meet them where they are, because in a sense, because it's so normative, that can be really offensive to someone. Like, you know, or people who are very, very early in their recovery, particularly young adults, they go to extremes. So by moderation, they may hear, I can never use this again, right? Which, you know, you'd be evil for saying that. So we pitch very early, what do you want this to look like? And try to help moderate use of tech, of any type of process or substance use disorder that they may have in their life, you know, or start off with some very basic goals. Like, what do you want? And again, I go back again and again to the making of someone who's building their self-concept, right? To get to where you want to be, what does that need to look like? And perhaps to do that, you might have to let go of whatever vice that you're using to cope with.
Yeah. I think one interesting aspect of this that you touched on earlier is how being a young adult in the culture that we have now, how that affects how you build relationships. What could you unpack that a little? Because I think I know what you're talking about, because like you said, like it's more than being someone in your DMs. So how do you kind of get them to understand that's not a relationship, or that's different than what other people might think of as a relationship?
Sure. I'll try to unpack that in maybe in a more roundabout way.
Sure.
One of the things that we specialize in at the Claudia Black Center is dealing with developing relationships, and moreover with how you handle conflict, i.e. bullying is a big thing. There are a lot of thugs in the world, right? Yeah. So it's trolls, trolls, absolutely. So it's very easy to, you know, scream at somebody or send out a mean message or even give someone your general feedback from a screen or from your keyboard. It's different when they're in front of your face. And I can't tell you how many times I've seen patients who just can't ask for their needs and wants outside of some sort of medium or divide, right? So we practice a lot with, and I'm sure you've heard this from other clinicians here at the Meadows, using the talking and listening boundary. But what I like about that the most is the ability to focus on your feelings. Yeah. Like when someone did that to you, how did that make you feel? And they would find it easier to send an emoji, like, let me send the angry face, right? Yeah. Or a thumbs down. I know that sounds corny, but any type of emoji or meme rather than expressing how they're feeling. So being able to sit in their own emotions, and actually being able to tolerate somebody else's, whether it's good or bad, negative or positive, is really difficult for them to do, primarily for those who've been submersed in the tech world, right? So that's a pretty good indication that either something problematic is happening or it's about to, you know? So catching them this young and the ability to step out of that and just give them new strategies and ways to communicate with people is big.
So then to kind of bring it around to kind of a hopeful note to end on, like what is your goal, or like what do you view as, I know success is very individualistic for each patient, but what do you view as a good outcome? What is your goal at the Claudia Black Center?
I glean on access and awareness. I won't pretend to be able to save everyone or for any patient to have some huge epiphany, but just the awareness that they take away from the work that they've started is big. It's big. They either come away with, I know I have a problem and I'm not ready to address it, or I know I have a problem and I have more work to do. I think that is a huge accomplishment, no matter what the very clinical treatment goals were. If we can just implant that seed, that one, you're supported, right? When I think back on something somebody told me a long time ago about addiction and recovery, is that the opposite of addiction is fellowship. And if I can have a patient walking away from the Claudia Black Center knowing that I have a community that will help me, whether I'm doing good or bad, mission accomplished. There's room for growth. Providing a safe environment to process their emotions and feelings are big. They're walking into an environment where they've not been safe to even say, I'm sad today, or I'm angry at you, mom or dad or brother, sister, whatever. And if we can do that, if they can just walk away just a little more emotionally aware of themselves, I mark it as a win.
Yeah. So kind of zooming back out, looking at bigger picture here. What's one thing you wish the general public understood more about the reality of being a young adult, going through this, the trauma, the recovery, and mental health, all those pieces?
As this might sound like a cliche, but that there's hope and they're not broken. Each person's life path is just different. But just knowing that you're not alone too. And I think that for a lot of young adults, even particularly for their families, believe that this is just unique to my family system. It's just happening to me, which is why, again, we glean so heavily on peer support and community at the Claudia Black Center, as well as in the addiction world, period. So just knowing that you're not by yourself. This is just a very, very small blurb in your life. And for some people, you're going to have to work at it. It's going to be a journey. It's a marathon, not a race. And there are people out there to support you. Yeah.
And that there is hope. You can come out better on the other side.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. And so for someone listening who wants to dive into this even more, what would be one of your favorite books, favorite resource on this topic?
That's a tough one.
You can pick more than one. Yeah.
I can pick more than one? Okay, thank you. Not to be biased, but Changing Course by Dr. Claudia Black. For me, reading that book was an eye-opener. Although, I'm not in recovery myself, I did have family members, particularly siblings and parents, who struggled with that. So for the first time, reading something that spoke to me about experiencing what it's like to be in a family system where there's addiction and trauma was huge. It was a huge eye-opener. And again, I go back to I'm not the only one. I think a good follow-up to that in Claudia's work, and it adds more of dealing with unresolved trauma, is Unspoken Legacy. I would say that my absolute favorite book, though, about addiction and recovery is Addicted to Chaos. Dealing with the intensity of life, and I think it speaks to our young adults a lot, right? There's this extreme theme, I got to go hard in the paint. I just can't eat one cookie. I'm going to eat 35 bags of Oreos and I'm going to do it on YouTube and Instagram and go viral, right? So just helping them understand that although it's not a substance that you're addicted to, there are emotions, there are other processes that are just as powerful and can quickly overtake your life. We see that. How many times do we see that with celebrities, particularly young adult celebrities? Intensity is real and it's addictive. I think it's a really good read. It's easy, in which it adds some personal anecdotes by the author Keith Lee. And that it adds there's a very small psychological perspective for all my clinicians out there who want the science. But for the most part, I would recommend that to any of my young adults.
Yeah. All right. We'll wrap up with this final question.
Okay.
What would be a favorite piece of advice that someone gave to you, that you've used in your life, something that you find yourself passing on? What would be something you'd want to leave someone listening with?
You can't do it by yourself. I hold on to that, no matter if it's work, it's life in general. Building relationships and having somebody either hold your hand or hold you up is really, really important. There is a campaign. It's not too new, but going around now. I don't know if you heard. It's called Check on Your Strong Friend. And if you've been like me in the past, where you have this positive impression management and everyone thinks you got it together, but you're like a duck where it looks smooth on top, but you're just paddling. So
but you want to be the one who's like, she definitely doesn't need help.
Yeah, I gotta hold it together. So I would say just being open and vulnerable to support, and I work on it daily, as I'm sure most people, and particularly my young adults. So, and I would never kind of preach or educate them with this if I wasn't walking on that journey myself.
Dr. Whitney Howzell serves as the clinical director at the Claudia Black Center for Young Adults, which is part of Meadows Behavioral Healthcare in Wickenburg, Arizona. You can find out more about how they approach helping young adult men and women heal from trauma and addiction at ClaudiaBlackCenter.com. To check out more episodes of this podcast and to find all kinds of other resources and tools from Meadows Behavioral Healthcare, visit BeyondTheoryPodcast.com. Finally, thank you for listening, and I hope you'll join us again next time for another episode of Beyond Theory.